Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this leadership episode of 30 Minutes to President's Club. My name is Armand Farouk, and I'm here with my co-host today, Nick Sigelski. And today we have Levi Thomas. He is a sales leader from CaptivateIQ. He was previously a director of sales over at Outreach and is a referral from one of the best guests we've had of all time, Shay Keeler. Nick, why should people listen?
Levi's got some really good stuff on identifying the stuff you actually should be focusing on, training and upskilling your team on, how you should be coaching that stuff, and then also how you should be getting buy-in from your managers when you are looking at broader organizational change. So we talk about how you can coach your team on small things. And then we also talk about the other end of the spectrum, which is how to drive bigger change. So if you're looking to make any sort of change in your organization and how people sell, this is one to listen to.
All righty, Levi, welcome to the Leadership Show. We start every show with your top 3 actionable takeaways. Let's get your 3.
All right. Number 1 would be focus, right? Don't spend your time coaching 50 random calls or 50 random things. Coach the 5 right calls or the 5 right behaviors. What that is, it takes a lot of prep, right? It's spending the time to identify of the 50 calls that you'll have to listen to, right? You're going to make sure that you're driving them down and saying, hey, I just want to look at the 5 pricing or the 50 pricing phone calls. And then I'm going to spend my time looking at the 5 pricing phone calls that something really great happened that I want to either go ahead and reinforce to the team, or maybe there's a massive opportunity that kept coming up over and over again, identifying that opportunity, and then coming to your team with a curated list of calls, or coming to that rep with a curated list of calls where the outcome can be somewhat controlled by you based off of identifying those behaviors ahead of time.
Boom. What's number 2?
Number 2 is when you are doing the more constructive calling, coach close lost or close lost deals versus deals that are often in flight. I think knee-jerk reaction, I want to jump in immediately and be like, oh, you did that wrong on that call, or hey, what happened? Why didn't you book this next step? But reps are inherently very defensive of deals that they're currently managing, right? That's their baby. And you'll have a ton more pushback trying to give feedback on deals that are active. Whereas close loss deals, the reps have already disassociated with somewhat. And so they're far more open to feedback, especially constructive feedback on things that they missed or areas that they could have worked on.
Let's do it. All right, bring it home. What's number 3?
The third one is have a coaching strategy or plan. For me, it's 3 R's, right? I want to make sure that my coaching and my training is relatable, that it's relevant, and that it's reinforceable. Relatable for me means that whatever I'm talking about is something that my reps are going through on a daily basis. It's not some random thing that I saw from a podcast. It's going to affect their day-to-day and help them close more deals. The second one, is it relevant to the deals that they're working on this month or this quarter, right? Is my training going to reinforce the outcomes that I'm hoping to drive from either a behavior standpoint or outcome standpoint? And then the final one is my training going to be reinforceable? So I want to make sure that anything that I'm talking about, if I'm going to spend an hour with my team, that I'm identifying something that I can continue to reinforce over time. It can be built upon, and it can ideally transition into an either new skill or another training down the road.
Levi, I'm glad you mentioned those closed loss deals as a great mechanism for training, because Armand, there's a lot of deals that I know you've closed loss that we're going to be able to coach you on. But Levi, I want to go back to your training strategy piece. What do you decide that you're going to train on in the first place? How do you identify what those big rocks of your training and coaching are going to be? Because I know you're quite intentional with it.
Yeah, I think Big Rocks is like a very apt description for it. I think it comes down to fundamentals. There's always a new fire in sales, right? Whether it be all of a sudden our pro serve pricing just got more expensive, or a competitor is all of a sudden coming out as super hot. But at the end of the day, typically the answer to those problems is a fundamental. So if we think about a new competitive piece, often was going to come back to value. Are we building value? Are we talking about our solution in the correct way? And are we talking about with the correct people? So even though that's a new problem, the solution is still a fundamental.
So for you at CaptivateIQ, what would you say your big rocks are, just so folks can make it real?
Yeah, I think it's probably the same rocks as almost everybody. So the first one is that we sell to value. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if something's $10 or $12 more expensive than something else, if the value is what the customer is expecting to see from it. And of course, like it falls within a budgetary piece. But I think value would be number 1. 2 is that we're talking to the right people. So at the end of the day, people aren't able to make a decision, then it doesn't really matter how much value that you're building. You need to be, speaking to folks that can actually make decisions. So who we're talking to, the value that we're providing, and then making it easy. So I think far too often we create barrier upon barrier, both internally and externally for our customers. So how can we remove those barriers and make it easy to buy from us?
What's an example of something that you had to train on recently?
I'd say maybe just to stick back to the question around making it easy. I think you'll see folks fall into a pattern of what's a typical cost around this. I think that's one that you hear all the time, right? You get in on the IM and you'll have that initial like deer in the headlights of, wait, I'm not supposed to talk about price on the IM. And so you'll spend 5 minutes doing everything but talking about it. And at the end of the day, you could something around the lines of, hey, typically a customer of your size pays X for something like this. Do you need to know more? Are you asking because there's a budgetary constraint? Like who's going to make the final decision about that? So utilize it as an opportunity to discover.
So how did you decide? Actually, let me take a step back. For those of you who might be used by the jargon, IM is just an introductory meeting, aka a discovery call. Levi, how did you figure out that was a problem on your team?
So I think in terms of my experience, there's probably three ways that'll come to bear. One is by watching calls, right? So watching tape, whether it be on Gong or being live within the calls. So being there either in person or watching it happen live, I think is primary and first one there.
So if number one is watching calls, what are the other two ways that you figure out what the problem is?
Yeah, I think the second one is working backwards from close lost. Watching calls is obviously the most proactive way to do it. You can answer the problem right away. The second one is when you're doing your close lost, identifying where things went wrong. If budget or pricing ends up being prevalent in those close lost reasons, going backwards and identifying like how long did we hide from that conversation as opposed to having it early, right? To understand, hey, what are things that we've talked about that. The third one is in one-on-ones. So identifying like, hey, what are the conversations that we've had around price and pain and knocking those out there.
So your big three ways of identifying your big rocks are watching calls, working backwards from closed loss deals, and then what you're observing in one-on-ones. And for you, the big rocks that you identified are, we got to be selling value, we've got to make sure we're talking to the right people, and then we need to make it easy to buy from us. How do you then integrate those big three rocks into how you're training and coaching your team over a week, a month, a quarter?
Yeah, I'd say the first one is to do your best to identify trends, right? I think at the end of the day, we're trying to make the most use of our time and spread that across the greatest amount of outcome. And so anytime that we can identify a trend that's happening either on a large subset of our deals, or a large subset of our team, that's typically where we'll focus in and identify, hey, where do we need to spend some time training or coaching? And then from there, it's like, how do we allocate our resources appropriately to manage that? Sometimes it is like a full-on training. You're going to spend 30 days and 4 weeks, and we're going to focus on this on every single team meeting and bring 5 calls that are representative of the problem. And sometimes it's maybe someone on your team is really great at this, and so they're going to become a SME or a subject matter expert on overcoming that objection or meeting the expectations of the customer there, and then we'll allocate resources from within the team.
Let's go back to that example of reps are struggling when they're asked about price on a discovery call. What did the training program look like for that?
Yeah, historically, I would say that this came to bear at Outreach. We'd been through maybe 2 years where we were very, I'd say, skittish around offering that up front. It was an incredibly competitive marketplace, and we were the most expensive in the market, right? So everybody was afraid of bringing that up front. I think at the end of the day, the training was narrowed down to not hiding from it and to use it as an opportunity to discover. So the training was about discovery. I would say, not to bury the lead, but at the end of the day, it's like when that question is asked, what are the 5 questions that we can ask on the tail end of that? First one is why. So I think it's really easy to say, hey, respect the question. Why isn't it important this early in the conversation? Is there budgetary constraints that we're trying to meet? So on that one particular, being a smaller problem, but definitely more prevalent across the team. On that one, we attempted to rotate it into a broader training. So the first one is we identified 5 calls in which it was happening. So the same sort of process that we talked about previously. We looked at 25 calls. We found the 3 or 4 that it was most prevalent or most egregious. We looked at the tape as a team, and then we talked about, hey, what would be a better way to answer this question that felt more direct and felt more comfortable for the customer. And then we were able to pivot that into an opportunity to discover off of that And so that particular objection became an inflection point to discover more around why around the question.
So you run that training, and at that point, are you reinforcing what is a pretty simple concept over several weeks? Or were you like, nah, once we ran this training, they got the point?
The reinforcement became on the discovery questions that were the tail end of that. So we identified the problem, and then from there, we went back and say, hey, are we asking these 5 questions or these 2 questions whenever we receive that objection or whenever we receive that sort of feedback from the customer?
Gotcha. And did you continue to coach discovery calls based on this specific point indefinitely in the future? Or did you or was this like one of those things where once you got the concept hammered home with your team, you went on to train something else?
Yeah, you can let it go once it stops becoming so prevalent in your calls that you're observing.
Question for you then. So the current team was trained on, hey, when we get asked about price, here's how we respond to that. Did you then do anything to make sure new reps who were onboarding didn't run into the same problem? Or how did you address the skill gap between people who are coming aboard and people who had already been through all sorts of different trainings, expectations, etc.?
Yeah, I think this is where you can take training from being good to like legendary is the documentation and reinforcement over time. So when you identify something like this in this scenario, right, and you spend the time, whether it be 1 week or 1 training or 3 weeks or 3 trainings, how do we then memorialize that so that it goes forward to all future folks, right? And so that's what we did in that scenario is like when those happened, they're captured, the training document is captured, and then we find a way to build that in to onboarding and enablement.
And so where did that live for you? Were you creating like a library of calls? Did you have a Notion document? I'm curious about like how you actually communicated that to folks who were onboarding.
Yeah. So typically the way that we would train is there was like the next 6 weeks planned out. So there was a doc. These are the next 6 weeks. Some were blank. Some were ready to be filled in with something that was like top of mind. Though when those sort of training documents and calls that we identified they would be saved in that, obviously the Google Sheet. And then from there, they'd be put into Seismic so that they could be leveraged in the future. We also, of course, used Outreach. And so there was the idea of creating call folders. You can do the same thing within Gong. And so, hey, if you're having problems with IMs, you can immediately direct someone to here's 5 examples of how to do it right.
What you're doing, Levi, is super smart. And the reason for that is as you learn things in the field, your training program needs to be dynamic. And you need to be able to train your team on 1 training in 1 week for a simple concept. And the 3 units of time that I oftentimes think of when I'm training my team are a week, a month, and a quarter. A week-long training or a single one-off training is oftentimes just folded into a bigger training. So for example, this concept of not mentioning price or not discussing price on a discovery call would just be folded into the pricing or the negotiation training, for example, or maybe into the discovery call. It wouldn't usually warrant a new training. If I've got to reinforce something for a month, that probably means in my onboarding program, I'm going to add an entire new training because this is a meaty topic on its own. But if I have to reinforce something for a quarter, our team is struggling on getting to power, I probably have to change multiple trainings because that concept is so big and so complex that multi-threading needs to live a little bit in the discovery training. It needs to live in the next steps training. It needs to live in the joint execution plan training. And now it's actually impacting multiple different trainings and probably has one of its own as well. So let's get off the 1 week, 1 training, and let's go to a meatier training. So Levi, what is an example of something that you had to train for either a month or a quarter long?
Yeah, I think the best example was as the market shift happened, call it about 1.5 years ago, all of a sudden there was that flashlight shine back on fundamentals, and MedPick all of a sudden revived itself from 5 or 6 years ago and became the hot thing. And training MedPick at Outreach, I would say, would be a great example of a quarter or multi-quarter initiative.
Training your team on MedPick is literally a forecasting / process overhaul from scratch. On the high level, what did that quarter long or however long training program look like?
The first thing with anything that big is buy-in. At the end of the day, it's hard to change a small behavior and to change literally every part of the process. So the first thing you have to capture is buy-in. I think the most important place to get that buy-in is managers. So at that time, I was in a hybrid role where I was supporting all the managers across basically the entire planet with outreach. And so at the end of the day, the managers are going to be driving the final reinforcement. And without them, it doesn't matter what you do, it's gone. So most training, especially that big, is a manager-driven activity. So getting them on board. So that's first one, which is just the buy-in. And the second one is the plan over that whole period of time. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to have every single piece mapped out, but you need to have milestones mapped out. You need to have outcomes mapped out, and you need to have a deadline for when you're going to hit those milestones. And you fill in the blanks in like the individual trainings as you move forward.
Could you give examples of those milestones and deadlines?
So with MedPick, it's really easy, right? Like I think you start at the beginning. You start with the discovery call and the pieces of MedPick that live there. That could tie obviously to things like cell stages as well. But are we nailing asking questions around MedPick? Right. And what that feeds back is, once again, to the fundamental pieces. Are we doing great discovery? And so what are the 5 questions that we can drill into our team's head of questions to ask to get to that metric, to identify the pain? And what are the 5 things that they can listen to or listen for to help like spur, okay, hey, now it's my time to ask this question.
The other thing that you mentioned first was actually, hey, this isn't going to work out. You can have the best plan with milestones, outcomes, dates. You can have an awesome plan. But if your managers are not bought into actually helping teach, implement, and reinforce this, it's ultimately going to fail. So when that decision was made and you were told, Levi, this is what we're doing, talk to me about what that first conversation looked like with any individual manager. How did you bring this to them? How did you position it? And how did you ultimately win their buy-in, even with some folks who might have been initially resistant?
As with everything, right? Like sales is sales. It doesn't really matter if you're selling a customer or a manager or a rep or what have you, or your VP. The first one is make it easy, right? And I think one of the easiest ways to make something easy is make the process transparent. Hey, this is what's going to be expected from you. This is what's expected from me. This is what's expected from the business. And this is what's expected from the reps. So laying out all the expectations is so important, because in people's mind, the work that they'll have to do for something is always 5 times more than what it really is. So assuaging those fears early is really important. And then the second one is just about outcomes, right? So what's the outcome? What's the with them, what's in it for them? What's the outcome that will drive together, right? And why is it worth their time? So this is how much time you're going to spend. This is how much it's worth. And then now we just have to do the math on whether or not the ROI is there for them, just like any other sell that we would do in any other time.
What if you have someone who's, I'm not really a fan of this. I don't really think, like, they don't buy in. They don't believe in Medic or MedPick. And literally the only what's in it for them is, this is the way you're going to keep your job. What does it look like when you have more of a stick rather than a carrot conversation?
I think that's where buy-in from leadership then becomes really important, right? Buy-in from the rest of the org. Very rarely is that person by themselves, right? So it's really difficult for someone to be the one person that's, oh no, I don't believe in this. I'm not going to row forward. So the answer to that question is it's almost like that saying, fire your worst customer. The idea is, if you have one person that absolutely won't move when everybody else is, it's a different problem. Right? If you've done the due diligence, you've done the work, you have buy-in everywhere else, then that's a problem to solve on with another conversation. So I'd say buy-in, I would say the answer to your question is an additional level of buy-in on their boss, the VP, the CEO, that this is an initiative that we're all going to believe in and carry forward.
One thing that helped me a lot was when I used to coach wrestling, oftentimes you get the kid with the bad attitude. And sometimes the kid with the bad attitude was actually the most talented kid on the team. And so what I would do is I would make them my drilling partner. I'd be like, great, you and I are going to demonstrate the moves together. So you actually put them front and center as the star of the show. And that oftentimes is the case with some of your top performers who think they know it all. Usually your top performers, a lot of them, the best ones, will be open to change. But a lot of people, when they're at the top, they're like, I know what I'm doing. And so the first thing that I would do is I would actually get them on board with it. So if I knew our team was struggling with price, I would go to my top rep, Morgan Mello, and I would be like, hey, Morgan, could you run this negotiation training for me? And here are the things that I want you to help me run with it. And by her feeling like she's rolling it out, not having it be received by her, she's way more bought in. And then everyone else follows the top rep. So if you can flip your top 3, the rest of the team will turn. And then if there are any people left, to your point, it's a hard conversation. but usually that will get you most of the way there.
I was going to say that kind of as a callback to when I mentioned around having a SME or a subject matter expert, right? Anytime that you can allocate resources from a manager on the team or then even like a rep on the team, hey, you're gonna be my metrics person, and hey, you really seem to gravitate towards this. Would you mind running some trainings? I think anytime you can surround the problem with more folks, A, it's a great use of time because you outsource it, and B, it just helps move the deal forward, or move the conversation forward.
So Levi, I want to go to the last piece that it got my attention early. You talked about a lot of your coaching conversations you have with reps are centered around deals that are already closed, lost. And I'm curious about this because I sell all of our sponsorships for 30 Minutes to President's Club. And last week, I sent our team a list of all of the ops that we've lost in the last year. And I'm curious, like, when you look at a list like that, where are you choosing to focus on the coaching? Is it on the most recently lost ops? Is it on the ones that had the biggest deal size? Is it the ones that you personally knew the most about? Is it just like intuition? How are you deciding which closed lost ops you are focusing the coaching conversations on?
I think ideally it's the op that helps drive the conversation or helps drive the behavior forward. So there's very few like you were there, right? You were there on the one-on-one calls and you listened to that call live, and maybe you were on that call. So you were part of it too. And so you probably have an idea of what went wrong. And so if I have a rep that I'm really working on having great pricing conversations, having great discovery conversations, then the call I'm bringing to bear is probably the one that feeds into that narrative, or the 5 that feeds into that narrative. And that kind of takes some prep. It's like that moment when you're on the call and you want to give that immediate feedback of, hey, you really blew it here. Instead, make a note. Make a note to revisit it in 45 days or 30 days or what have you. Let it cool off. And that feels weird, right? That feels counterproductive. But I think there's a lot to be learned from thinking about a year as opposed to right now. That'll help you on the next 50 or 100 or 5.
There's a couple follow-up questions I have to it. Is one, like, where are you actually storing those notes? Do you have a system that you're using to keep track of that? 2, how are you broaching that conversation with the rep? Like, how do you bring it up? Do you bring it up on the one-on-one? Are you like, hey, remember what happened 4 months ago with that deal? Those are some things where my head naturally goes that I'm curious about.
So Levi, I want to take this one step higher. This is once you've already decided that you need some closed lost opportunities because you say, hey, my team's struggling with price, or they're losing to no budget, for example. I know one way you're identifying these trends is by watching calls. The other way that you mentioned as number 2 was through closed loss reports. And I've struggled with this a lot in the past because I find that reps tend to not know why they're losing deals and aren't always the best at diagnosing. And sometimes the data can be really messy and noisy. And so I'm curious, how are you approaching closed loss reporting differently?
I'd say one is tag it while it's warm, right? So when every week, I think a great exercise any manager can go through is every week, look at every deal that was closed lost and tag the ones that stand out to you. There'll be 8 of them that died after the demo because you were talking to the wrong person or what have you. But there'll be the 2 or 3 that will almost certainly stand out. Tag those for later. For me, I keep track in Excel, or I'm sorry, like a Google sheet, and I like to folder them. Hey, these are the 4 calls that bucket into we lost because of price, and I don't think we should have. So this is an area that we messed up. This was on us. And these are the 4 calls that drive into it. And I think it's all about like planning for the future. Is like we're constantly in the trenches giving feedback to our team, but are we planning for 3 months from now when we have a critical mass of like 10 calls that we can really dissect and analyze, and then help to build that foundation and that sort of like pattern recognition for the team. To your point, Armand, is everyone's bad in the moment. And it's not until you can create that critical mass of 5 examples of you doing the same thing over and over, then in that point, you can really drill the point home. It's unrefutable.
So this is a really smart nuance. And the reason for that is, let's use the example of closed loss due to price. That might be what the prospect cited. And usually you can get good data on that. Now, what you need to do is that's when you need to use your brain as a leader, where you say, okay, what are all the reasons a deal could be closed loss due to price? One of which is we don't know how to handle competitors. We don't know how to do great discovery. And the last reason might be, yeah, we're too expensive. but it at least tells you what the prospects are saying. So you can have truth in that, because usually closed loss due to I couldn't do good discovery is usually not a closed loss reason to my knowledge. And if it ever was, it would never be one that is used. That said, the one other metric that I find really helpful for coaching, and I'm curious how you use these things, is stage drop off. So while a rep might not know if a deal was closed loss due to price because of a value issue or a competitor issue, you can almost always be certain the deal is dropping off in the multi-threading phase. It probably has something to do with their ability to win over power or get to power. And so I'm curious, how do you use stage conversion, if at all, relative to your closed loss reasons?
Yeah, I think it'll depend a little bit. And yeah, I'd say the difficulty with stage conversion is like most metrics that are dependent on a sales rep moving a deal manually, either through a Salesforce stage or through a pipeline stage. Most stages that I've seen, they'll move to 1 and 2, whatever that looks like, the top 20%, right? Because they have to, because it has to do that in order to move to qualified or what have you. And then all of a sudden there's this sort of like ghost town of 20 to 75, and that's where all the deals die. And if you're going to use stages, it means that you're signing up for the massive lift of hammering home stages on every single one-on-one and call with your team forever, because they're never going to do it naturally. I just have never seen like a rep that does it. So I think stages are helpful, and they're more helpful the fewer they are and the fewer barriers there are to entry. Pipeline stages, I think, is what I've used more aptly in the past. So being able to say, hey, this is best case, or this is likely, or whatever you want to call them. And so identifying, hey, why did my deal in commit die? Or why did my deal in best case die? I think from a staging perspective, that is helpful. And I've used that in the past.
Levi, we got to move to the next stage, the final stage of this interview, which is the final question. We're running out of time. And the last question is this. We've talked about a lot of really great things leaders should be doing. Now I got to ask you about a shouldn't. And so the last question is, what's one thing that leaders should stop doing so that every team that they coach gets better and better?
So the number one thing leaders should stop doing is wasting people's time, right? I would say that's my hot take. So wasting people's time is, if you're not coming prepared, then how are you going to expect your team to come prepared to their calls? So when you're going to have an interaction, whether it be a team meeting or a one-on-one, do the prep work, come prepared, have an outcome in mind, and drive the conversation towards that, and stop wasting everybody's time with things that don't move the team forward.
Amazing show, Levi. Everyone hang on for a 60-second recap coming up soon. Alrighty, Nick, it is time for a 2x2 recap email from this episode with Levi Thomas. What do you have for your 2?
So first one is, when you are looking to identify your big rocks of where you need to focus on with the team, there are 3 sources of where you can identify that stuff. Source number 1 is by watching call recordings. Source number 2 is by working backwards from closed lost deals. And then source number 3 is from what you can glean from your one-on-ones. Takeaway number 2 is, each week, you should automate a report that shows you all of the deals that were closed lost that week. And then you should look at them and tag the ones that you think are indicative of a broader theme that you might want to focus on with the team in the next month or quarter.
Number 3, there are 3 different styles of trainings. You could do 1 week, 1 training. You could have something that goes a month long, where you might have to do 1 training and 3 reinforcements, or you might need to teach something over a quarter, and your program should reflect the intensity of that training appropriately. And lastly, number 4, whenever you're rolling out one of those bigger trainings, let's say you're trying to train your team on MedPick over a quarter, you need to start by getting the managers bought in and your top reps bought in. That might mean you should have them literally deliver some of the trainings on your behalf. Alrighty, Nick, how can people help us out?
If you liked this episode and you want a full playbook on how to train your team, Armand, I know that you and Mark recorded a 30 MPC playbook episode on how to train your team. We will put a link in the show notes if you want to go listen to that one. But if you liked this one, you probably should listen to that one. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on the show.